And now, on to chapter 8. He woke in dimness, felt the softness of a bed, or at least a cot beneath him. I keep doing this, ran through his mind. A quiet figure raised its head and gave him a drink. He wondered dimly if this were the same healer who had cared for him after the last fight for the town. He slept again. He wasn't sure how long he slept, though he later discovered it had been a day and a night, with waking periods from time to time. When he really woke, the lady and Gwathnerin were sitting beside his cot. "You've done it again, Quedrim," Anabristi said. "We've taken the town." He shook his head, causing a sudden wave of vertigo. After that had passed, he said, "It wasn't just me, lady. There were a lot of others out there too. And they'd have been slaughtered if you hadn't dealt with those pottery men. We lost heavy enough as it was." Gwathnerin looking at him as an expression on his face as though he'd only just seen Quedrim for the first time. "Did what I could," Quedrim muttered. "And you did it well. What gave you the notion to use those rocks the way you did?" "Just figured I could slow them down by aiming at the legs, and when they got too close for that, seemed using the stones from above would do better." "And you need to rest." Anabristi looked at Gwathnerin. "Gwathnerin, stop pestering him. Just say he did well and let it go at that." Gwathnerin nodded, his stern look returning. "You did well, Quedrim. Now rest, as the lady says. We still have a war to fight." His two erstwhile housemates also visited him, breezing in and making low mocking bows to the Lord Quedrim of the Big Stones. Quedrim couldn't help but smile a bit. "And I see you two are as mad as ever. I understand we did well enough?" "Oh, well enough indeed," said Melsanto. "Seems the pottery men, what were left of them, collapsed and died. If died is the right word, when Losabalson died. I heard Casabanyo say that it was most likely a precaution taken by Batlas so Losabalson couldn't lead them to anyone else. Batlas would have had to have been mad to turn troops like that over to any commander of his commanders without some safeguard," Genelavis said. "Imagine having your own invulnerable warriors show up to facing you on a battlefield." "So, will you be up out of that bed in time for us to march, Quedrim?" demanded Melsanto. "I should be. I wasn't hurt, you know. Just tired myself out a bit more than I ought." Valdo also came by. He had a bandage on his left thigh and he limped along, but he seemed to be in good spirits. "They say I'll be back in shape before the march." "March?" "Oh, yes. The lady sent word to her people to gather here for the summer campaign. Sent word before we left the wood at Budaba, which shows her confidence. People here are starting to show up already, and while Lord Gwathnerin for certain doesn't tell me what's in his mind, it makes sense he'll be marching soon. We'll be marching soon." "How soon?" "Oh, don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to get back on your feet again. Lift some stones, that sort of thing. Might even be able to make some money with your sling if you give the right odds." Valdo said that with a grin, but Quedrim found himself wincing inwardly at the thought of how he used to make his living. He managed to find a grin of his own. "The lady rewarded me for saving her life way back there last year in the city of Higford. I haven't spent all of that yet, so I don't need to go running games on the side. If you want, though, you can lay bets that I'll be out of this bed in good time to march with the rest. Won't find anyone to take that, even at big odds. But I better get along. I've got a 20 captain who doesn't like me at all, and something about a woman, and he's looking for a way to get me into trouble. Even for a lame and wounded hero, he finds little chores to be done." Quedrim chuckled. "You're a real veteran now. You know all the tricks." "Perhaps not all, just enough. I'll be by to see you again later." Quedrim noticed that a few other lords stopped by. Not that he'd expected such visits, having a fairly objective notion of his popularity in that quarter. "Just see Sobel Dancer dropping in to see if I'm all right." Even before he'd thrown in his lot with the Carmista, all his games in all those towns and cities, what he called friends, were more like friends of the moment, joining him for his endeavor, this endeavor or that. He still at times had trouble accepting that Malsanto and Genelabus didn't really expect to gain anything by their association with him. Or perhaps if they did, it would be on the basis of favor for a favor. Casabano came to see him, sometime after he'd been released from the healing house. I'd have come sooner, young Quedrum, but I've been doing a lot of studying. You've heard about that last pottery man. About the last pottery men? How they died when Lasabalson did? Yes, I'd heard about that. Seems like a sensible precaution for even Batless to take, assuming he's as foolhardy as the tales say. Yes, but the fact they were so connected to Lasabalson would seem to say that Batless had managed to transfer complete control, not just command of this body of pottery men, to Lasabalson. It's another little bit of information about them, though I'm not sure just what help it will be to us, save in the sense that any little bit of information we gain is another piece of information we didn't have before. So I used your notion of each of them only being able to take so many blows when I used the stones on them. Aha! Do you think there was something to it? I was too busy keeping the stones moving to try to keep count, but it seems to me there was more to it than wishful thinking. If it will help, even if it's only a minor comfort to our soldiers, that things can be beaten, eventually. Staying around to hit something you know can in time be killed is different from staying around to hit at something that seems unkillable. A minor comfort for sure. Yes, but you, I assume from your present state of health, you'll be ready to do your part if we fight them again? Yes, but you say if, is there some chance we may not fight them again? I wish I could say yes or no, but in war there's always a chance that this or that will happen. For certain, there's an intent on our part to fight. Quedrum drew a deep breath. From the time he'd been able to stay awake for any time in the healing house, he'd been training with the stones. The ability was coming back steadily, but for all his positive outward attitude, he wasn't at all certain how long it would take to build himself back up to where he'd been before they stormed Lac Vosta. Word came one day, with a dusty messenger from the south, and a rumor promptly spread it through the town. Batless was marching up toward them. That much was sure knowledge. The numbers of his army varied according to who was passing the rumors. Such figures as 300,000 or 400,000 were plainly ridiculous, as were figures such as 2,000 or 3,000, even if the latter included such figures as 1,000 pottery men. There were also persistent rumors that Quedrum was dead or had deserted them. This was foolishness, of course, but it could not go unchallenged. Quedrum, the Lady University said, would you mind going and showing yourself around town? Do a few tricks with your stones, that sort of thing? One of the last things he wanted to do was go doing tricks in public with his stones. For one thing, how did you do that without laying bets? For another thing, he thought that was the old Quedrum who did such things. This was the Lady University looking at him, though, asking him to do this. Yes, lady, I'll do what I can. So he and Lords Malsanto and Genelabus went out, night after night, visiting wine shops. After they had a bit to drink, nowhere near drunk, just easy, one of the lords, most often Malsanto, would say, Quedrum, do us your trick with your dancing rocks. So Quedrum would complacently take out some of his stones. No bets were laid. He only put the rocks through some tricks, hopping on the table, stacking in an inverse pyramid, or fly around someone's head, things of that sort. After they'd gotten sufficient attention, he'd keep on doing tricks, then they'd leave. Often as not, some people would follow them, and when they went into another wine shop, the tale would be passed, and he would be urged to show off again, so he would. He had developed and kept developing new tricks with the stones, which meant he had a fair repertoire, so he was not showing the same tricks in place after place. He spent freely, though he drank less than he seemed to, which gave him another reputation, that of a hard head for wine. There were fewer rumors about your death or desertion now, Quedram. There are still a few who insist they've seen some fellow in disguise doing clever illusions. That, however, we can live with. Thank you for your efforts. It wasn't much, nothing at all, lady, and it gave me more practice. But I made you into some sort of performing bearer or the like, and now a lot of people are saying you're a show-off. It's not fair to you. You've done so much more than that. Any residual rancor Quedram might have felt melted away. Lady, I've done difficult things for you. Why should I balk at something so easy? Which brought a fuller smile. Lord Quedram, you have been a real gift to me. Thank you once more. Clothes? What do you mean I need new clothes? Quedram, friend, housemate. You perhaps have not noticed that your outfit, which was once quite nice, is in sad disrepair? And while I'm not the picture of sartorial elegance that Malsanto thinks he is, I still manage to keep my knees from showing through my trousers. You think I should dress fancy as if I were some sort of lord or something? Quedram, my friend, you are a lord. Or had you forgotten? And while no one thinks you should become an ostentatious spectacle, a little care for your appearance would do well. Suppose just the two of you come along and give me some advice. I could just order another suit like this. I could just order another suit like this one that was what it was when it was new, but I suspect you have something different in mind. When he showed up in his new suit, he was pleased to see Lady Anavristi smile at him. We now have some reasonable figures for Betlas's army, Guthnarin said. He looked down at a piece of paper in front of him, and then up at the council. 8,000 men. These include 600 horse, 800 in the phalanx, most of the rest light infantry of sorts, and 1,000 potterymen. Most likely estimate for our own is 6,000, so the odds are against us, and when you include the potterymen, we are badly outnumbered. He paused and looked around once more. However, there is no denying that we took this town, Lakvosta, against bad odds. Without deluding ourselves, we could see this as a possible victory. Quedram, are you capable of using your stones for us? Capable, Lord Guthnarin, but in this town we had a fight limited to the width of a street, bounded by walls. A battlefield would be a different matter. Yes, indeed. The main question is deployment. We could have you fight against one section of the army line, perhaps two, given a fast horse and rapid judgment, perhaps three. I prefer to have you opposite the potterymen, knowing you are supporting them would hearten the men in that sector. That sounds wise, so far as I can see. I'm not a military man. I'll go by what you say. Fine. Now, are there any other questions? Yes, I have one, said Sobald Dancer. This man, who has been given lordship and precedence, will skulk behind the lines, safe from enemy blades? What would you have, Sobald Dancer? Put him up front where some fool archer can put an arrow through his guts and prevent him from giving us any help at all? Surely you know enough tactics to see he must be protected in order to serve best? Sobald Dancer sat, glowering quietly. Quedram could tell he wouldn't have been satisfied, not even if this man were out in the front of the line in some honorable position. In fact, if Quedram were in such a position, Sobald Dancer would find that to be an insult to his own honor. On the other hand, if he were behind the lines, he was skulking, manifestly a coward, unworthy of trust put before him. For Quedrim to point this out to him would only make him all the angrier. He reminded himself that he already marked Solbadancer as a man to be watched. The army of Higrid was marching again. This time, Quedrim was near the front, in the same vicinity as Lady Anavristi and Lord Gwythnarn. His rank as close friend meant that he could no doubt ask for the Carmista's time and be able to talk to her. That was a nice thought, but he did not avail himself of the chance. What had he to talk to her about? The policy of the crop from the land he owned? Nonsense! He was a lifter and mover of stones. Little more. He did not have the military expertise that Gwythnarn had, even as much as Daldo, wherever he was back there in the column. He should have said something, that he should have anything useful to say to her. Come to think of it, he had less military expertise than she did herself. No, he had nothing to say to her, as much as he might wish to have. One advantage to his present status was that he heard news shortly after it came to the lady, which relieved him of the necessity to sort through 24 rumors to work out what was most likely. This, in turn, meant he heard every night the likely position of the enemy, and also the probable time before Gofrati were facing the enemy on a battlefield. Since his knowledge of local geography and landmarks was minimal, however, none of this, except the time estimates, meant much to him. Then one evening they found themselves camped with the enemy over the next rise. Sentries ringed and guarded their camp while parties of light horse scouted forward. A night attack was not likely, but it was possible. Quedrim also knew that, though Gofrati had picked up a few hundred more men in the course of the march, they were still badly outnumbered. It was now confirmed that Batlas had 1,000 pottery men with him. Their mere presence was worth a larger number in terms of morale. Quedrim took advantage of his status to speak to the lady in the planning session the night before battle. Lady, I have a notion. Well, more like an expansion on your notion of juggling stones in the wine shops of Lac Bosta. Go on. Suppose we collect an assortment of the men, and I do some juggling for them. Not sling stones, real boulders. Then we send them back to their regiments. Let them pass the word as to what they saw. It may only help a little, but it's better than nothing. She looked at Gwythnarn. Seems like a good idea. Lord Gwythnarn? He smiled slightly. Yes, as he says, whatever little help it might be is still help. The fire lit the scene. Groups of men, all units, sitting or standing and waiting. The stolid men of the phalanx were marked by their calm patience. There were others, light infantry, some even painted with the body paint they would wear into battle tomorrow. The whole group was a selection of the army that would be fighting the next day. First thing, Quedrim said to them, I want you to be sure there's no trickery here. No fake stones, no wires. Pick 10 or so among yourselves, come up here and look at these stones. Feel them. Make sure that it's all in the up and up. Go ahead, make your choices. He waited with patience as they talked among themselves. He could have picked out some by pointing at them, but having them pick their own representatives made the test that much more persuasive. Of course, there might be some who would think the choice of witnesses had been rigged, and there were some ways he could have done that. However, Quedrim had hoped the most reasonable men would be convinced. He hoped that they would take that conviction to their units and pass the word. At length, several pikemen and a large number of light infantry, archers, and slingers came forward. They hefted a stack of head-sized stones that Quedrim had gathered, felt them all over for wires, and finally pronounced themselves satisfied there was no deceit here. Now, I hope none of you have been foolish enough to bet against me. And if you have, I hope you've made a big bet, because it'll serve you right when you lose. There was scattered laughter. Off we go then. One of the stones lifted and flew, swooping around Quedrim. One after another, they lifted and soared until six of them were flying around him, just above the level of his head. He waved them into a line, though no hand gestures were really needed, and had them swoop down abruptly at the audience, sweeping by a little over their heads, forcing them to duck wildly. A moment later, the stones came back higher again, higher this time, and resumed their flight around Quedrim's head. You notice I'm not laughing at you. You saw stones coming at you, and you ducked. Any man of sense would. Just think how Batless's men will be ducking when these things come at them. Now, does anyone want to see any special tricks? Stand them up on your head. Quedrim brought the stones up to stack just over his head. Anything else? Stick him up Batless's arse, called a rough-voiced slinger. Quedrim grinned. That's for tomorrow's show. There were other calls. Others were maneuvers. Quedrim obediently brought the stones into various formations and marched them around and countermarched them through the air, stacked them and spun them. He heard one of the phalanx commanders call out, Too bad your lot ain't that good on drill, Belsaldo. Finally, he set them down. That's it, lads. I gotta save some strength for tomorrow. By the time the men left for their units, Quedrim was sweating. You haven't worn yourself out, Quedrim. Quedrim looked up at Gwathnaran. He heard in the words not so much concern for Quedrim himself as concern for the weapon Gwathnaran was going to need the next day. Let me sleep until dawn. I'll be fine. In actual fact, he was still groggy when they woke him at dawn. He had a bit to eat, and then got on his horse. The army was falling into position, making ready to advance in the formation in which it would meet the enemy. Fatigue parties had filled 2 ox carts with stones the size of his 2 fists. Boulders are fine for some purposes, but Quedrim thought he could do as much damage with smaller sized stones, as well as being able to keep them moving longer. The ox carts bumped and creaked behind him, and he kept his eyes open for when they had their first sight of the enemy. He was just a little left of the center of the line. It had been arranged that the light cavalry patrols would go forward and hurry back to say where the potterymen were in the Dari battle line, and Quedrim would move there as quickly as his horse could go without him falling off. And those ox carts aren't going to be able to move very fast. I might have to grab some stones as I go, he thought. A light horseman was galloping up from the left now along the front line. Guessing that this was the man who was to direct him to his proper place, Quedrim turned his horse in that direction. Sure enough, the man, a tough-looking, grizzled old fellow, pointed one hand towards Quedrim's left and cupped the other to his round mouth. They're about a bow shot that away. Right. Just like an archer to say things in terms of the range of a bow. How far will a bow shoot anyhow? He thought. He turned his horse and began to trot down the line. Nope, the ox carts weren't going to be able to keep up. He whisked some stones out of the nearest one and brought them over with him, a score or 2. It was feasible for him to send each one separately, but that might wear him down too soon. His best plan was to get them into a line and send them back and forth through the enemy lines as many times as he could manage. Now the enemy were in sight, coming this way as rapidly as the Graffardi were approaching them. Yes, the potterymen, moving in their deceptively clumsy fashion, could be made out. He was still not quite there. The potterymen were on the left of the flank of force of light infantry and spear and shield, with a hatchet or a sword for when things got too close. An idea came to him. Not part of the plan, but still. He swung a score of his stones into a line and sent them into the Dori light infantry. Not head on, but angling back to his right. He saw the light infantry fall into disorder. Men went down, others stopped, a few even fled altogether. Now the Gafrati were nearing close quarters. "Old woman's apron!" He turned back to his right. The potterymen were still a short distance away, but he wasted more time than he thought. He whipped another score of stones out of the nearest ox cart, flung them into a rough line, and sent them just over the heads of the Gafrati, diving for the shins and ankles of the potterymen. He brought them whipping back again at shin level, and had to pull them up rapidly to avoid hitting his own men. Now he brought them down again, to the shoulder height, slamming down hard on pottery heads and shoulders. The Gafrati light infantry, despite all promises and demonstrations, were having trouble dealing with an enemy who, even without armor, absorbed stroke after stroke without obvious harm. He could see another flaw in the Gafrati plan: dust. The field was mostly grass, but even so, that many feet moving, stepping, stamping, caused dust to rise. In short order, it was difficult to see far down the line. See if there was a section that needed help more than this one. Should he go look? No, his tomfoolery had already cost some small part of the advantage that his ability gave them. Best stay here and pound up and down, watch the occasional potteryman crumble to fragments. Abruptly, the potteryman's line was too thin. The infantry were surging in among them and striking hard. Too many blows for the enemy to absorb. Quedrim trotted further to the left and came to a spot where Gafrati were starting to give way in front of the continued press of the enemy. He paused and began crashing his stones on heads and shoulders. Urgently, as though by sheer force of will and hammering of stones he could throw the potteryman back, he went to work. His breath was coming in gasps by the time the pottery line was weakened enough for the Gafrati to come through. When he moved again, he found himself in a spot where the Gafrati had either been killed or driven away, and the potterymen were swinging in against the exposed flank. Again he went to work wildly, using his stones and strength with abandon. He wouldn't be able to keep this up much longer, and if the Gafrati attacked front and flank gave away, the battle might well be done. There were horsemen in the dust beyond the potterymen. Old woman's apron! All he knew about battle tactics was the bits and pieces he picked up, but it seemed sensible for Betless to send in cavalry to exploit a gap in the Gafrati line. Then things changed in the blink of an eye. As the cavalry struck into the rear of the potterymen, swords rising and falling, enemies spinning and falling away, some of them even breaking up. Raising and lifting the fist-sized stones was becoming an intolerable burden on him. He paused for a moment and felt himself begin to fall. He grabbed hold of the reins and turned the fall into a clumsy sprawl. He found himself sitting on the ground, without the strength to rise again. Somewhere over there his stones were lying on the ground, unheeded. He found another one and began to raise it and bring it down. The arrival of the Gafrati cavalry from behind the Dari line seemed to suggest they were victorious off the right flank, but the potterymen were still fighting. They would do so until the last of them were smashed, or until their master called them off, or until he was killed. The stone slipped and fell. He lacked the strength to raise it again. He did not lose consciousness this time, only lost the will to do anything but sit and watch the fight, idly wondering if some shift of things would find him sitting in the midst of the potterymen, whom would sure finish him off. Even when the fighting was done, the potterymen marched off, ignoring the cavalry harassing them. He continued to sit there. He thought of many things he could have done better. None of this brought him any comfort. Okay, so that was Chapter 8. Thank you so much and have a good night.